And what we'd like to do now is ask another big question. And the question is, what if we could think about our problems differently? And to navigate us through that complex question, I'd like to introduce Adam Morgan, who's the author and founder of Eat Big Fish. Now, Adam is really interested in how challenger brands compete against brand leaders, and also in the way that entrepreneurs and business leaders think about that sort of space. So can I ask you to join me in welcoming Adam Morgan?
Thank you very much. Linda at the beginning of the day asked us to reimagine leadership and what it actually meant in an increasingly volatile world, of which obviously geopolitics are a key part of it. And President Putin offered a very interesting high-level directional answer to that question on a TV show the other day. They had in April, you remember, I think it was April the 16th, they had the live call-in show where he invites all of Russia to pose him questions, not unlike today, but on a larger scale, and he will answer them on TV in front of the rest of the population. And somebody was brave enough to ask him about sanctions and how long he thought sanctions would last. And this is his response, as tweeted by the Moscow correspondents of The Guardian. Putin doesn't answer the question of how long he says sanctions will last. He says instead that we need to use these sanctions to develop ourselves more. What he's suggesting is we invert the problem. We actually see it as an opportunity to make us more than we are at the moment, rather than restrict us and make us less. So is this a bit of kind of noble chest beating by a leader of a world economy, or is it actually a genuine response to a problem? Is it actually being adaptive, as Sir Jeremy would say, in a more intelligent way in response to the kinds of new problems that we face in the world? I've spent the last 3 years kind of researching and exploring this kind of question, really, which is how do you turn problems into opportunities? And I'm just going to explore kind of some of the implications of that and 3 of the strategies I suggest that are involved, because it raises some important questions, right? So is it possible? If it is possible, is it nature or is it nurture? Is it a eureka moment or a series of strategies? Is it a capability that we can learn ourselves and lead and teach to a much broader group of people to help us cope with the volatility that's coming up? And my interest in the topic started when I went off to see another global leader, Tom Ford, talk about fashion and film at the Curzon in Mayfair on a stage not unlike this. And he was being interviewed actually on 2 chairs by a rather gushing journalist, an appropriately gushing journalist from the Times. And he was being very witty and very urbane and talking about a single man and Colin Firth and his new film and fox terriers and all this kind of stuff. And everybody in the room fancied him, men and women. It was just a fantastic kind of moment. You could feel the love coming up from the stage. And then they throw it open to the audience and say, got any questions? So I put my hand up. And I said, well, look, I've heard that you see your catwalk shows as filmic, and I'm interested to know what you've learned from the world of film that you've applied to fashion, and what you've learned from fashion you applied to film. His response was very interesting. So I'm going to be Tom Ford briefly for a moment here. So imagine that he's been sitting there, he's been very unbuttoned, he's been charming, flirting with the journalist, all this kind of stuff. Asking the question, his body language completely changes. He leans forward, he puts his hands together, and he says, what you have to understand is that in a catwalk show, you have 13 minutes. It doesn't say roughly quarter of an hour or not long. He says 13 minutes. And he says in that time, you've got to convince a very cynical, seen-it-all audience. You've got Anna Wintour sitting in the front row, that you've got the most exciting vision in the world. He said, so you have to be very dramatic. He used these amazing words. He said, boom, act 1, out you come. You turn up the music and you turn down the lights and you go on with the show. Boom, act 2, on you go. And then he said this astonishing thing. He said, my ambition at the end of that 13 minutes is to get the entire audience breathing in and out at the same time. I will know if my catwalk show has been a success if, as the last catwalk model leaves the stage, I can hear the entire audience exhale as one. And I was really, really struck by that he's got this, these very fierce constraints, limits of time, very cynical kind of audience. And you might be tempted in that situation to say, how much can you do, really? Really? We'll give it a go. But he doesn't. He actually raises the ambition to an almost ludicrous degree. And it's the juxtaposition of that constraint, that problem, and that ambition that leads him to develop this incredible sense of theatricality about what he does. So I became fascinated about constraints and how they stimulated more and better rather than reducing us to less. And once you notice that, of course, in the world around you, you start to see it and read it everywhere. Would we really be using Twitter in this forum as keenly as we do if the limitation was 14,000 characters rather than 140? You probably know the story about Google's homepage. Google's homepage is the way it is as simple as it is, because that, in fact, in 1998 was the limit of Larry Page's coding ability. All he knew how to do was put on a search box and a logo, and he couldn't afford to hire anybody else to do it. And once he sees it, and he sees the wonderful simplicity of that compared to the noisy homepages of Lycos and Alta Vista and all his competitors, he puts his first female engineer, Marissa Meyer, on it and says, don't let anyone touch that. And she preserves it and fights for it for 10 years, amongst other things. And indeed, on the right-hand side there, the most popular character in the biggest entertainment category in the world is, of course, Mario. Mario is the way he is. He has that character because of the limits of 8-bit technology at the time. So the designer, a very famous game designer, wanted to create the first plot-driven game. And it was, you will remember, a love triangle involving a man, a woman, and a gorilla, which became known as Donkey Kong, of course. And so he wanted to make his protagonist very kind of human. So in order to make him human, I'm going to show you, this is the 8-bit, this is what it actually looked like. He had to put a disproportionately large nose on him, but to show where the nose ended and the chin started, he had to insert a moustache, otherwise you couldn't see the difference between the two. To see where the arms ended and the body started, he had to put him in a boiler suit. Hair was way too difficult, so he put a hat on him. And that's why Mario is still the most colourful character in video game history. So in each of those three cases, the constraint was a stimulus to better. It was a stimulus to more. There was different kinds of better. It was characterful, it was simple, it was user-friendly, but it was better. And we have a difficult relationship with constraints, don't we? Because there are some of us, engineers, Martin said he was an engineer when he started, some of us engineers, software designers, certain kinds of problem-solving junkies who see constraints right at the beginning of a problem as being good. It helps us define what the parameters for that problem-solving are, where we'll focus our energies. For most of us in business, we don't see constraints as good. We see constraints as limitations, things that make us less. But as we move into a world where we're going to have more and more unusual forms of constraints, we're going to have to change that. We're going to have to invert that. We're going to have to be like President Putin. We're going to have to start seeing them as opportunities. So what does that mean? How would we do it? I'm just going to offer you three of the sort of 6 strategies that seem to kind of people seem to share when they do this, and then offer some observations at the end. The first thing is about how we ask questions. How we frame the challenge. I've sat in too many meetings, so besides being an author, I'm also a consultant, and I've sat in too many meetings with my clients where actually the inclination is to frame the ambition. Here's our big ambition, and we somehow remove the constraint from the problem. This is this awkward and inconvenient truth that we really are a bit under-resourced, or we've got to do this in 2 months rather than 12 months, or we don't have an R&D department. And we somehow take that out of the room, and we focus on how we're going to deliver this big ambition, and we'll get to reconciling that with the reality of our business and the constraint later on. And actually, go back to Tom Ford. He doesn't do that. What he does is he takes that really big ambition. In fact, he dials the ambition up and he couples it with the constraint to make them one and the same challenge and question. And I'm calling these propelling questions. So actually linking specifically the size of your ambition and the specificity of your constraint into one is a propelling question because it propels you out of the path that you've been using for the past 5 years. You simply can't answer that question in the way you've answered your last 5 or 6 questions. It makes you think in a different way. If you talk to cognitive scientists, they talk about it as a bit like a paradoxical frame. It makes you uncomfortable. It actually forces you cognitively to interrogate the underlying assumptions between things that you've just taken for granted up to now. So let me give you an example of a propelling question. One of my clients is Audi of America, and their CEO, Scott Keogh, tells a wonderful story about Audi re-entering Le Mans in the mid-noughties. And, clearly if you're going to enter Le Mans, you want to win it, right, particularly for a car manufacturer. So imagine that I'm the chief engineer and I'm sitting with the engineering team of which you are part. What's the right question to ask you to solve this problem? And clearly you would have thought it's got to be something about speed, right? It's got to be about how can we make the car go faster. very natural kind of question to ask. But he thinks to himself, well, actually, most of these cars are pretty fast anyway. Actually, they've all been wind-tunnelled up the wazoo, and actually they're so quick they exert 2 tons of downward thrust. That's to say that theoretically I could drive this car upside down on this roof, provided I could find a roof big enough. So let's not think just in terms of fast. Let's ask a different kind of question, he said. Let's ask ourselves the question, how could we win Le Mans with a car that could go no faster than anybody else's? Win Le Mans with a car that could go no faster than anybody else's. Bold ambition, significant constraint. I can't answer that through wind tunnels. I have to answer it in a completely different way. It's a propelling question. And the answer is, we can win Le Mans with a car that's no faster than anybody else's if we put into the pits less often. Because actually it doesn't matter how fast we are as a car. If I put into the pits less often, anybody can overtake me. So their solution, of course, was diesel technology. The R10 TDI, which they introduced, and I think it was about 2006, put into the pits less often. Sure enough, won Le Mans the next 3 years, 1, 2, 3 on the podium. Propelling question forced them to come up with something that was a better solution than they, or indeed anybody else, had before. So let's rethink the way we frame the question. Let's bring the constraint right into the question and use it as a stimulus to make us think better and different. Second part of the strategies, if you like, for turning problems into opportunities is to how we actually create answers. Because clearly if you're going to ask these very difficult kinds of questions, you've got to give people help in coming up with the answers for those. And I went to talk to a man called Colin Kelly, who's the Chief Technical Officer of Warburton's, the bakery, second largest grocery brand in the UK. And he has a very interesting way of creating a culture about answering problems. Because one of the issues about problems, obviously, is optimism, right? So keeping optimism alive in a difficult problem-solving culture is really difficult. We think of ourselves as optimists, but we see other people around us as being rather less optimistic than we are. So we think we're very gung-ho and very positive, and we see other people really quickly kind of cross their arms going, Adam, really? I don't know, propelling questions? So we've got to keep optimism and inquisitiveness alive at the same time. So Colin has this technique. He says, I don't allow anyone in this room to start a sentence with the words, we can't do that because. They have to start the sentence, we can do that if. Now, when I first say that to you, that's going to sound like the kind of glib thing you'd expect a consultant to tell you from a stage in a lightless room on a Tuesday morning. But it's one of the most profound things I've heard in the last 15 years. Just think about what it does. It does 3 important things. First is, it keeps the conversation around how this problem can be solved, rather than whether it can be solved. Second, it keeps optimism and inquisitiveness alive in the room at the same time. And third, we all know we are the stories we tell about ourselves. That's what culture is. Culture is the stories we tell about ourselves. And in that sentence, the story we're telling about ourselves is we are people who find solutions to problems, rather than we are people who create barriers and impediments. So let me just give you an example. This is Made.com, the online furniture retailer. Made.com decided last year they wanted to exhibit for the first time at the most prestigious fashion show, most prestigious furniture show in the world in Milan. The thing was, it's expensive. You'd expect it to be. So their propelling question, if you like, is how do we exhibit at the most prestigious furniture show in the world, in Milan, if we can't afford the exhibition fees? And the can if you like, was to say, okay, well, we can if we don't actually appear in the exhibition hall. We can if we find 4 of our fans who have apartments in Milan and we say to them, can we borrow each of those apartments for one day and we'll actually exhibit in your apartments? And that would be better, wouldn't it? Because then actually the furniture is in a real environment, so that's kind of cooler, and it's out of the main drag, so perhaps we'll get the press along. They got 1,000 visitors in 4 days through those 4 rooms, and they got massive press coverage because, of course, actually they were doing something that was fresh and imaginative, like you would hope a creative furniture company would do. That constraint of not being able to afford the exhibition hall created a better solution than if they'd been able to afford it in the first place. So I became very interested in CANIF and thought, well, actually, could you characterize different kinds of CANIF if we wanted to start with a team and as a group to look at what the possibilities might be, where might we start thinking about it? And I tried to take sort of the 75 or so cases that we'd looked at and cluster them roughly into 9 different kinds of CANIF that explore all sorts of different areas, from funding to resources to reframing problems and thinking of them in different ways. And the third strategy is really about resources, actually. It is about resources. And we talked about networks this morning. And The point is, of course, I love I think it was Professor Stevenson once of Harvard who characterized an entrepreneur as someone who pursues an opportunity using other people's resources. And I like that as a kind of a definition. And I just want to tell you, my notion really is here is we have to get used to thinking of our resources in a different way. And in a post-abundant world, we see our resources in business as the things we own and the budget we are given and the assets we are sitting on. That's not how an entrepreneur thinks of it. That's not how we need to think of it going forward. We need to think of ourselves as having an availability around us of abundance that we don't own, but we have access to. And our job as leaders is to work out how to access those and make the owners of those want to let them flow to us and allow us to use them for our good and for theirs. So let's go to Africa. So I interviewed an NGO in Africa. This is an upcountry area of Africa called Nakuru, where they have a high proportion of hawks and eagles. So they have chicken farmers there who are having 85% of their chicks eaten by these hawks and eagles before 10 weeks. So 85% mortality rate. This is the sad part of the speech, ladies and gentlemen. We've had the happy stuff. This is where the tonal range drops into a rather tragic level. So they have to work out what they're going to do about that. And what they find out, this NGO, is if they paint the chicks purple for the first 10 weeks, the hawks can't see them anymore. Now, you think I'm making this up, don't you? So I'm just going to show you that this actually is the case. They paint them with gentian violet, which they get from the local chemist because there is no purple paint. And so by the time they get to 10 weeks, they can kind of defend themselves and look out for themselves effectively. They know how to hide from the hawks. But now there's a second problem, which is now you've got all these chicks, and actually they need to feed, and they're foragers. So the further away, because there's less food near the hut, the further they get away from the hut, the more likely they are to walk into the path of the mongoose, who's about 15 feet out of there, is not fooled by this purple business at all, will eat any coloured chick day or night. So now the NGO has to find a way of feeding these chicks for free. Where's the adjacent abundance there? Well, the adjacent abundance is insects. There's roughly a ton of termites under each acre of Kenyan soil. They've simply got to work out how to get the termites up out of the soil into the chicks' mouths. But they don't have to solve that problem themselves. They can be networked. They know somebody who knows a tribe in Western Kenya where they eat termites. They go and find out how they catch termites using waste corn stalks. They bring that technology. They teach it to the chicken farmers. The chicken farmers get free food. Adjacent abundance of resource, of knowledge. So just give you an example from business. When Virgin America launched in the States, they spent all their money creating the cabin experience. So it's in about 2008, creating the cabin experience. They had this purple mood lighting that they knew was a huge trigger for trial. But the thing was, they'd spent so much money on designing the cabins, they couldn't afford the media to actually promote it, to show all of you this trigger for trial. So they had to get other people to do it for them. They had to find ways to get you and the media to show their cabin for them to actually drive that trial. So what they did was they created a series of events in the middle of that cabin that were newsworthy, that were picture-worthy, that would get people to show a picture of it. So, for instance, they did a partnership with Victoria's Secret where they had a catwalk show down the middle of the aisle, in air, on the way to Las Vegas. This is a cabin show of cabin-appropriate pajamas, in case you were wondering what that was. And you can see the response. Other people took pictures for them and broadcast for them the thing that they wanted to show, their strategic trigger for trial. That was their adjacent abundance. That's how they harnessed it. That's how they led the solution. I'm sure you'll have seen this. This is from Tom Goodwin of TechCrunch, in case you think this is a fringe thing to do with chicken farmers. In 2015, he said, Uber, the world's largest taxi company, owns no vehicles. Facebook, the world's most popular media owner, creates no content. Alibaba, the most valuable retailer, has no inventory. And Airbnb, the world's largest accommodation provider, owns no real estate. It's quite a famous thing, although he's only said it a couple of weeks ago. The way that we think about resources needs to completely change. We need to be more networked. And this is one of the ways, along with how we frame questions and how we look for answers, that we need to adapt to turn our problems into solutions. So what if we could rethink the way that we saw our problems? What if we could actually learn to see that constraints are in fact a stimulus to better, rather than a way of a force of efficient repression, as Sir Jeremy would say? That actually making constraints beautiful is nurture, not nature, and it's a series of strategies rather than a eureka moment that anybody can learn and apply, and we can give names to, and we can take our teams through them. And actually that's important because as individuals, as business people, or frankly as citizens of the planet, how good we become at doing this is going to define our progress and our happiness and our children's progress and happiness over the next 15, 20, 25 years. I've written a book about this. One reason I've written a book about it is I have 2 children. One of my sons is sitting in the audience here. This is going to be critical to how he navigates the future and how successful or unsuccessful he is and leaders of the world are at doing this will define what his life is like. So at the very least, we need to get better at saying, how can we make this constraint beautiful? Just invert that understanding of it. And perhaps actually, there are 3 specific constraints that we need to get really good at making beautiful. The constraint of fast, the constraint of brief, and the constraint of under-resourced. We're all going to have to move faster, so Jeremy talked about that. We're going to have to get really good at it. And brief, I don't think we understand quite with the world of continuous partial attention how good we're going to have to get at being brief as well. Look at me, it says time's up down here. I have to be even briefer. And under-resourced. If I said, how many of you in the room, hands up, those of you who have more resources than you know what to do with, I bet you wouldn't see many hands going up. We have to get really good and really muscular at these constraints, which really is kind of why I wrote the book in the first place. Thank you very much indeed.